Andrew Roberts is a British historian whose 20 books have been translated into 28 languages. They have won a total of 13 literary awards and include Napoleon the Great and Churchill, Walking with Destiny, both of which spent several weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. He's a trustee of the Margaret Thatcher Archive Trust and the National Army Museum, and is president of the Cliveden Literary Festival. He's also a visiting professor at the War Studies Department of King's College London and the Roger and Martha Mertz Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He was recently elevated to the House of Lords. You have to talk like that when you're in the House of Lords, you know. As Baron Roberts of Belgravia, the citation for which mentioned his services to history, writing, and literature. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our ninth and final speaker and an august way to end the season, Baron Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited to address you, and thank you very much indeed for those kind words. Paul, can you hear me at the back? Good. Sorry? I've, needless to say, forgotten to do the one thing that I was told to do prior to coming up on the stage. As I was saying, it's a great honor to be invited to address you, and thank you very much indeed, Paul, for those kind words. And thank you also for mentioning that I have just been ennobled. It was a little bit nerve-wracking last year, owing to the fact that I was appointed by Boris Johnson and confirmed by Queen Elizabeth II. And then after Boris fell, I had to be reappointed by Liz Truss. And then when the Queen died, I had to be reconfirmed by King Charles III. Not since the Wars of the Roses has it taken 4 heads of state and heads of government to appoint a peer. I was starting to take it quite personally, I have to say. It's a wonderful place, the House of Lords. You never ask anyone why they're there. It's a bit like prison in that regard. And you also, your children get to be called the Honourable, which I like to point out to mine, in their case, shows that the British establishment has a sense of irony. I'm going to be talking to you today about Britain yesterday and today. It's going to be a positive explanation about the way I feel about my country, but I don't for one moment want you to think that I'm sugarcoating it, owing to the fact that we do have tremendous problems in Britain. We've got a cost of living crisis, which is leading to some 50 pubs a month closing. We've got inflation at 6.8%, incredibly low productivity. It's only grown 5% over 15 years. We've got GDP per capita that's set by the end of this decade to be lower than that of Poland, South Korea, and Slovenia. Americans, if they stopped working in late September, would still have a higher per capita GDP than the United Kingdom. We've got NHS waiting lists that are at 7.6 million, which is the longest in the 75-year history of the NHS, the National Health Service. We've got a freedom of speech crisis in Britain at the moment, where if you even so much as like a tweet that is critical of the idea of transsexual men going into women's restrooms or sports or their prisons and so on, even so much as like a tweet, you can be completely cancelled. You will have places where comedians, for example, having their venues cancelled just on the back of liking a tweet. We've also got these channel crossings, which since 2018 have seen 100,000 people come over in small boats, come over the 22 miles of the English Channel, taking tremendous risks, dying in large numbers. Only last week we had 6 people die on one boat alone. It's the most appalling tragedy, and they're not from is, as you'd expect, incredibly poverty-stricken and war-torn countries necessarily. They're from places like India and Vietnam and Turkey, Albania and so on. In a sense, of course, it's a tribute that anyone would want to risk their lives coming to Britain under the circumstances that I've just described, but they do. But for all the problems of modern Britain, of Britain today, I believe they can be solved, and they are being solved in part, by the genius of Britain yesterday. Our forefathers set up a system that gave us the tools to solve the problems of the present. Foremost amongst these, of course, are our Constitution. We have a system whereby the Constitution, through the first-past-the-post system, encourages strong governments, but not extreme ones. It also means that there's a good deal of agreement across the aisle. The leaders of Britain tend to agree about what the major problems are. You have leaders who are there because they have the confidence of the MPs that they lead. And that also is a positive thing, at least for British politics. I'm a Conservative peer, but Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, the leader of the Labour Party, will make a fine Prime Minister if he became Prime Minister. He's an upstanding and decent and impressive, honourable man. And so he won't embarrass the United Kingdom if, as is widely expected, he becomes Prime Minister in the October of next year. But in Rishi Sunak, the Indian-born Prime Minister and the leader of the Conservative Party, we also have an extremely impressive leader, somebody who I'm proud to serve under as a peer. He has all the qualities, the intelligence, the hard work, the penetrating understanding and insights. And so that's a very positive thing about my country. Brexit, which has not fully delivered what it set out to and what it can and what I believe one day it will, unfortunately, at the moment, it simply hasn't. And I think, as an historian, that it's too early anyway to expect something quite as massive as leaving the European Union after 47 years to be immediate, the effects to be immediate. But at least it does mean, ladies and gentlemen, that we now make our own laws, something that you've taken for granted in this country for nearly a quarter of a millennium. But for the 43 years before we left the EU in the January of 2020, it was simply not the case. Brussels could overturn laws made by the House of Commons, passed by the House of Lords, and signed by the monarch. And so now that we are able to make our own laws, we have a chance, I think, to strike out on our own in a positive way. Now, a few of you will have failed to notice that last year was an extraordinary year in British politics. We had a period where there were 3 prime ministers in 6 weeks. The story of Boris Johnson is essentially a truly tragic one, almost sort of Shakespearean bathos, I think, is the best way of looking at it. He came to power in the December of 2019 with a majority of 81 in the House of Commons, an enormous majority, the largest since the days of Margaret Thatcher. And now he's in a position where he is so disgraced that he's not even allowed to go into the House of Commons. He's not allowed to visit the House of Commons. And he was brought down by something that also, I think, underlines this extraordinary sense of bathos. When Neville Chamberlain was brought down, it was because of the Norway debate, the appalling defeat in the Second World War. When Anthony Eden was brought down, it was because of the Suez Crisis, which humiliated Britain in 1956. When Margaret Thatcher and David Cameron and Theresa May were brought down, it was because of Britain's relations in Europe. These were great national issues of the moment. They were tremendously important for the country. Boris Johnson was brought down by 4 parties that he went to. He went to 4 drinks parties, one of which it was only soon after he had survived a life-threatening attack of COVID, and then afterwards was found by a pretty party group of MPs sitting on a privileges committee to have lied to the House of Commons. So compared to these great occasions, these great national issues, we have this Prime Minister who was brought down, as I say, by things that simply can't be seen to have been as important as any of theirs. I think, as well as our Constitution, the House of Lords is something that is a very positive thing in British public life. It's not something that's very widely understood. It's something that is very easily and very often misunderstood, sometimes deliberately politically, including by people who, of course, who want to abolish it. The Labour Party say in their manifesto that they're going to abolish it, but we don't feel too threatened by that, owing to the fact that they've had it in their manifesto since 1899. Nonetheless, it's perfectly possible that they might. The House of Lords has been, essentially, it's been in various different iterations, but it can trace its genesis back to Saxon times, when it was the Witan, the chief counsel of the king. And it's not clearly anything that one would invent today. The idea of peers being appointed, or 92 of them coming entering the House of Lords as the result of who their fathers and grandfathers going back into the realms of mists of time. But you don't have to read much Edmund Burke or Roger Scruton to appreciate that there is a place in the human heart, apart from anything else, for tradition and for a reverence of the past and for heredity and for custom. And that really is what the House of Lords is all about. When I was introduced, after this ceremony that takes place in the chamber of the House of Lords, where you're wearing the ermine and the robe and so on, and you then sit down and take your place. And I looked up at the 24-hour clock that they have in the chamber, and it said it was 23 minutes past 2, so it was 14:23. And I sat down, and across the aisle was the Duke of Somerset, whose family entered the House of Lords in the year 1423. So you see what I mean about a sense of history. The other day I was thinking about giving a speech which was going to include a reference to the Battle of Waterloo, and I noticed again across the aisle from me was the Duke of Wellington. So that slightly put me off the whole idea. It's an extraordinary place. It's, of course, I always think of it as a cross between Valhalla and Hogwarts. You have an average age of 71. I'm 11 years younger than the average age. You often walk down the corridors, these wonderful book-lined corridors. We have 80,000 books in the library there. And you see somebody coming towards you and you think, aha, that's why I haven't read that chap's obituary. There are many, many criticisms of it, not least the size. It's now the largest legislative chamber in the world after the People's Republic of China, their parliament there. But nevertheless, the key thing is, and this is something you'd probably guess from Burke and Scruton and other philosophers, the key thing is that although you wouldn't invent it necessarily today, it works. The amount of work that is done there in revising the House of Commons, the laws that we get sent across down the corridor from the House of Commons, is extraordinary. In fact, the hardest working people there are the hereditaries. They're the ones who know that, of course, they're there because of the hereditary principle, rather than anything that they themselves have done in their lives. However, they make up for that by working so much harder, by attending more. We have many of the front benchers, many of the ministers are hereditaries, who've been there for in one case, 40 years, and who have extraordinary experience and are willing to put in the hard work. And boy, do we revise the laws. Sometimes the House of Commons sends us legislation that just doesn't make sense at all. It's made because of the populism of the day, because of the democratic need and will to pass some kind of law in response to the media or in response to public demand. It might be contradictory with itself and with other laws. And what the House of Commons does with tremendous expertise is to go clause by clause, sometimes sentence by sentence, line by line. I've seen debates taking place on commas and semicolons, and make sure that a law would work if it were put into practice. And that is why, although of course we don't throw out the laws of the House of Commons, or at least try not to as much as possible, and we don't have the constitutional right to hold up a law for longer than a year anyway, nonetheless, the work it does really is integral to the working of the British Constitution. The next aspect, I think, of the Constitution that only really works because of heredity, which, as I say, with the House of Lords, if you say, as the Labour Party do, that they're going to throw out all the hereditary members on the basis just of heredity, well, where does that leave the monarchy, ladies and gentlemen? Because that clearly also is something that is entirely based on heredity. And at the moment we have the new king, King Charles III, and Queen Camilla, who have proved to be surprisingly, but definitely and undoubtedly tremendously popular. They are cheered to the echo. This is something that you wouldn't necessarily 25 years ago, quarter of a century ago now, at the time of the death of Princess Diana, have foreseen. I knew Princess Diana. She gave my wife some flowers when our son was born. I was the NBC commentator for her funeral. And it's impossible to look at what's happened since without recognizing the appalling tragedy of the 31st of August 1997. However, a great deal of water has gone under the bridge since then, and it's something that the British people appreciate. They appreciate the way in which Queen Camilla makes the king happy. They appreciate the way that the king is probably a caretaker between the Britain of yesterday, which was personified by Queen Elizabeth II, and the Britain of tomorrow, which is personified by the Prince of Wales when he becomes King William V. And what an awful lot of people don't appreciate is quite how hard work being a monarch, being a royal is. This is something that we of course see in the media. We see the easy times, the bits where they're waving to huge crowds from balconies, the bit where they're enjoying themselves, going to film premieres or walking down red carpets and so on, the fun side of it all. But ladies and gentlemen, there is a very, very much harder job involved in being a royal than just in waving to crowds and walking down red carpets. When the royals, especially the Prince and Princess of Wales, Kate and William, when they go to a town in South Wales like Newport, I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, I've been to Newport. It's not like Newport, California. It is somewhere that they will have travelled hours to get to. It'll be a wet Tuesday morning. They will have to remember everybody's names. They will have to remember something about everyone from the mayor and the alderman. They will have to say some well-chosen words about how wonderful that Newport is. I have to tell you, they will have to be very well-chosen. And they will leave that place. They will leave that place with everyone who met them feeling that that was a really special day of their lives. The photos will be on the sideboards and on the mantelpieces for the rest of these people's lives. It matters. It matters enormously with regard to the morale of the nation. But it is very hard work. And that is something that I feel, I'm afraid, that the Duke of Sussex did not make clear enough to the Duchess of Sussex when they got married. Again, with NBC, I was the royal correspondent for that wedding at Windsor. And at that time, Harry and Meghan had an 82% approval rating. We were so thrilled that a prince of the blood was going to marry a biracial woman. It was going to be the great modernizing moment for the royal family. It was something that everyone was thrilled about. But as it turned out, it seems that incredibly hard work side of monarchy was not something that appealed to the royal couple, which is entirely their right. Of course it is. But what they didn't need to do, ladies and gentlemen, was to make life so much harder for the Waleses. That was unnecessary. The Oprah Winfrey interview, in which accusations were made and were not backed up with any evidence whatsoever, has been tremendously damaging for the royal family and also for the Crown Commonwealth in its results. It's a tragedy in a way, of course it is, but that 82% of people who had a positive dispensation towards towards Harry and Meghan at the time of their wedding is now down to 6%. They are as popular as lawyers and realtors, and hemorrhoids. One of the really shocking things, one of the moments at which the popularity collapsed was when in his autobiography, Prince Harry boasted about having killed 25 Taliban in the Afghan war. Ladies and gentlemen, that is something that a British officer does not do. And it was absolutely disastrous for his popularity, as you can imagine. And of course, one of the excuses he might have made was that he didn't actually write his own autobiography, but I don't think that really lets him off. He must have read it at some stage, presumably. When I tweeted that it was absolutely vital for the Waleses and their children never to fly in a helicopter together, because, of course, if it crashed, that would mean King Harry and Queen Meghan. My tweet got 750,000 likes almost immediately. There are lots of reasons, many reasons that I feel tremendously proud to be British. I just like to, they're not in any particular order, and I know a few of them might not make sense to you necessarily, but nonetheless, I'm just going to chuck a few out. One is the sheer splendor of eccentricity, of British eccentricity. I'm proud of the fact that Ed Pratt is a Briton. He was the man who spent 3.5 years going around the world, 21,000 miles, on a unicycle. The Rail Times for Great Britain's summer revision. It's a book of over 1,000 pages of railway timetables. And it is the Bible for something called train spotting. I don't know if you have the same thing in the United States. I don't think it exists actually anywhere else in the world, but this is a hobby that people have where they go to train stations with their cameras and with this book, the Rail Times for Great Britain's summer revision, and tick off all the trains that they see go by during the day. They find out the numbers of the trains, they work out the types of the trains, and they tick them off in the book. There's an equivalent hobby called plane spotting, and in Greece in 2001, 12 British plane spotters were arrested as spies. And they were kept for a week because the Greek authorities could not believe that anybody would have a hobby quite as weird as plane spotting. But it makes me proud to be British. In that book, there are the names, the beautiful, euphonic, often Saxon names of the villages and towns that that the rail ways stop at. I'd just like to name a few, just to call out a few names of these, I don't know, for some reason I find them tremendously beautiful. So trains will stop at Walton-on-the-Naze, Hadfield Peveril, Wivenhoe, Ingatstone, Wymondham, St Neots, Inverkeithling, Iscar, Pontefract Monkhill, and Denby Dale. Aren't those the most beautiful names, ladies and gentlemen? I'm very proud to be British because we are leading the global movement to protect the apostrophe. It's a tiny but vital piece of punctuation, ladies and gentlemen. We can't do without the apostrophe. Everybody who ever writes any signs outside shops and saloons and so on thinks they can do without the apostrophe, but they can't. There are some more serious reasons, I suppose. I'm very proud that Britain makes charity donations larger than the GDP of 70 countries. I'm very proud of the fact that when the British government put up a website for people to invite Ukrainian refugees into their homes, the website almost immediately crashed. And ultimately, we took 150,000 of these poor, viciously ill-treated people. And of course, I was very proud at the time of the late Queen's funeral, where all classes, all regions, all ethnicities came together to show their grief and pride. Some of them spent 30 hours in that line. There were 250,000 people. At the end, they had to turn back people from the line because there was no longer any time. She really was the best of us. So despite Britain's problems, there are reasons to be cheerful, many reasons to be cheerful. Our technology industry is the third largest in the world after yours and China's. It's twice the size of Germany, it's 3 times the size of France. We came up with the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine and we rolled it out faster than any other Western country except for Israel. That would not have happened if we had not had Brexit. If we had still been in the European Medical Agency and gone at the speed of the slowest country, was essentially what the EMA did. It's estimated there would be some 10,000 Britons who are alive today who would not have been, had it not been for us coming out of the EMA as a result of Brexit. We are world leaders also alongside the United States in fintech, in AI, in some advanced manufacturing. We're seeing breakthroughs in clean and abundant energy, renewables. About a quarter of our entire energy comes from wind farms in Britain, and that's getting bigger all the time. And in film and music and literature, I think British production is admired throughout the world. So there are lots of positive reasons to be cheerful. We play a very active part in the world, on the world stage in the United Nations and NATO and so on. Britain has, again, since Brexit, been able to make its own way in really important moments, such as the Ukraine war. We were the first to send anti-aircraft munitions to Ukraine, the first to send anti-tank munitions. Then we sent battlefield tanks. We were the first again to train up pilots on NATO warplanes, and we are now the first to send cruise missiles. In each case, yes, you have produced and given far more than Britain in every single one of those cases. But it did take somebody to act as point man for you, and that was Britain. Thank you. And when you're told, ladies and gentlemen, that there's no such thing as the special relationship, we're told that constantly in Britain. I think I've read the obituary of about 5 people who've written the obituary of the special relationship. And it's simply not the case, ladies and gentlemen. When it comes to nuclear technology, when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to the threats that face you and us and the rules-based international order, when it comes to our literature and our language and our law, we have so much more in common, and that's another thing, I think, that makes me proud to be British, the fact that we have a special relationship with you, the most powerful nation in the world, and one that is based ultimately on values. So, to conclude, yes, Britain has got problems. Yes, we've got the way to deal with them. We have got leaders who will be able to deal with them. And in our friendship for you, and thank God yours for us, because you've saved our bacon twice in the 20th century, we are friends yesterday, but also today and in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Question time. I have my marks.
Yep.
Okay. I have one question first, okay, if you don't mind. You have written this book on Churchill, which, how many books have been written on Churchill?
1,009 biographies of Churchill. Yeah.
But yours is a one-volume set. Some of those volumes, other ones, were written in multiple volumes. And it has been said by as many as 13 different people that this was the definitive one-volume set on Winston Churchill. You care to comment?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is there a question? No, just good.
Would you care to comment?
I was very lucky, really, because my book came out at a time that where I was incredibly fortunate to be able to use a huge amount of new information. And you'd have thought it'd be impossible to have new information about somebody as famous as Winston Churchill, about whom 1,009 biographies have been written. But I was tremendously lucky that Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen, allowed me to use the diaries of her late father, the King, King George VI. And he met Churchill on every Tuesday lunchtime of the Second World War. And they of course, had to serve themselves because nobody else could be present, because they were talking about which countries were going to be invaded, which admirals and generals were going to be appointed, which there were no secrets between them. Churchill told the King about the ultra decrypts and every secret there was in the Second World War. And the King, of course, never blabbed to anyone apart from his diary. And so there was a huge amount of fascinating information about that came from the Royal Archives. But also there were 53 sets of papers that had been donated to Churchill College, Cambridge, since the last major biography of Churchill. And so I was able to use them as well. Various members of the family helped me. I was able to use the love letters of Pamela Harriman, which had never been published before, which were extremely helpful indeed, owing to the fact that she led a very active love life during the Second World War. Very active indeed. And then there were the diaries of the Russian ambassador, Ivan Maisky, who was ambassador to London 1930 to 46. And so you have this, and he also met Churchill on a very regular basis. So yes, there was new stuff to say about Churchill, and that, I think, was one of the reasons that it sold 500,000 copies, I'm very proud to say.
Sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Lord Roberts. Evidently not American, but as an Englishman married to an American but living in Hong Kong, what is the role of Britain when it is stuck between a China, a US, and because of the special relationship, Britain is viewed maybe as an adjunct to the US, and potentially stuck amongst a third party, which would be the European Union, now that Brexit has happened? What is the future role of Britain when it is not an adjunct to the US?
Very good question as well. I've got good news for you as a Briton. Actually, we've got a magnificent future, because of the adjacent nature that we have with the US. As I mentioned with regard to Ukraine, we led on each of those things, and the United States does want to have a partner in military operations and so on. It doesn't want to just be forced to be the only actor on the world stage. And if we can be with them and close to them, and hopefully in some cases, like in Ukraine, guiding the way forward, then that's a very positive thing. I think the fact that our values overlap so much, democratic and open values overlap so much with the United States, and the way in which they clash so completely with those of the Communist Party of China. Not with the Chinese people, not with China itself as an ancient city, but particularly with the Communist Party of China, which rules China and has done since 1949. That strikes me as a very clear moral difference. With regard to the EU, we of course need to get on with them as well as we can. We took it for granted that we were going to be punished for Brexit because they didn't want the whole of the European project to collapse because of the success of Brexit. But ultimately, we are seeing some positive things that are coming from our connections with the EU. I mean, trade. Just in trade terms, for example, we've increased in the last year our trade with the EU, which is a good thing. So, all in all, I think that Britain has an obvious place in the world, which is to be the friend and ally of both the European Union and the Americans, but a really firm friend and ally of the Americans.
I've heard about the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism of a particular British Labour politician, and I've heard about the terrible treatment by academics, of Israeli academics. And I know you founded an organization in support of Israel, and I wonder if you could explain this issue.
Yes, the organization, I was one of the founders. There were plenty of other people, including Nobel Prize winners. We had 3 presidents and several prime ministers. It's a wonderful organization called the Friends of Israel Initiative. And what it was really is for non-Jews to stick up for Israel, essentially, in the face of what is still an ongoing monstrous level of anti-Semitism. I'm afraid the attacks on synagogues and on individual Jews went up 37% the year before last in Britain, which is it was already a very high level. And part of that was because it was legitimized by the open anti-Semitism of various members of the Labour Party, who, because of the laws of libel and the fact that I'm being videoed, I'm not going to mention, except for when you come up afterwards to buy the book. But it's not difficult to work out who I'm talking about, frankly. The good news about all of this now is that the present leader, who I mentioned, Keir Starmer, the present leader of the Labour Party, is really rooting out anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He has expelled people for it. He's not putting up with it. He's fighting against it. Jews who had been essentially sort of forced out of the Labour Party are back there now. It's a shame they didn't come to the Conservative Party, but if they're going to be in politics, it's good that they've gone back to their original roots, and they don't feel ostracized in the same way that they were. So I think that the Labour Party has turned over a new leaf, thank God, finally. But you still see it as you mentioned, in academia, with regard to some of the campaigns. There is, for example, a Islamic youth movement, a ultra Islamic fundamentalist student movement that, for some reason, is allowed to have the Iranian Revolutionary Guard speaking to it, even though, which of course should be a banned organization in Britain, but for some reason isn't. And you can understand how Jewish students feel extremely uncomfortable when that is happening in their universities. So there's still a battle to be fought, but I think we've turned turned the worst of it.
Sir, as someone who provided additional artillery support to First and Second Queens in Germany in the mid-'70s, I understand and respect your pride in being a Briton, having worked with those two regiments. My question, you've done a great job really updating us on Britain today. I'd like to have your thoughts. What's Britain going to look like? What changes do you see in the next 25 years?
Golly. I think that with regard to those big problems, let's just have a look at those big problems that I mentioned. I think with regard to inflation, well, that is coming down already. Productivity, I'm afraid I just simply don't know. I think that there's a good plan for it that Rishi Sunak has, but whether or not he's going to be able to implement it, certainly in time for the next election, is another matter. If you were to win the next election, then yes. The small boats problem is a truly devastating one. I know it doesn't sound devastating in numbers, in American numbers, 100,000 people, but because you, of course, have to multiply it by 5 or 6, because you're 5 or 6 times bigger. That's 500,000 people coming over illegally. And we have an awful lot of people coming into Britain legally and who contribute enormously and who are very useful for the state of the nation and the prosperity of the nation, and they're people who become tremendously patriotic and so on. But that's not found by the majority of the illegals. However, we've passed laws that are going to mean that people are going to, assuming that the human rights courts allow it, which is a big assumption, will be picked up from when they come onto the beaches of Britain and taken to Rwanda, which ultimately must deter the people from coming in the first place, and more importantly, break the financing model of the tremendously evil people traffickers who entirely base their business on the fact that these people are going to be able to allow to stay in the UK. So that's a positive aspect as well. But unfortunately, quite a lot of the things that need to be done will probably not be done if the Labour Party win the next election, and at the moment they're 20 points ahead of the Conservatives, so they probably are going to. And this, so ultimately, I'm optimistic in the short term and not so optimistic in the long.
So I send you regards from your friends at Hoover. My question comes in, you were clearly part of the understanding of what happened, and give us your insights. And that is, after Churchill in the mid-'60s, the country went far, far left. And 20 years after, it was bankrupt. What is it that the people just didn't understand about nationalizing the airlines, the railroads? The only thing they didn't nationalize were the banks, but they only have 5 banks.
Yeah, but it did nationalise the Bank of England.
And the Bank of England.
In fact, yeah.
So everything got nationalized. The pound fell to below $1, below parity, and it took a Thatcher to bail the whole thing out. What is it in the psychic of those 20 years when you have a very strong socialist government, a labor government that appeared to be socialist even more so, that it seemed like the wheels came off the bus in those 20 years?
Well, thank you for mentioning Hoover. I'm actually wearing a Hoover Institution tie at today.
You know how much that tie cost?
It's completely free, actually. Anyway, to try and answer your question. Actually, it wasn't really the 1960s when Churchill died, of course, in 1965, that this started. It wasn't really Harold Wilson. You have to go back to the 1945 general election defeat of Churchill by Clement Attlee. It was him who brought in the welfare state. a lot of things turned out to be very different from the grand and rather uplifting concepts that they originally came up with. The National Health Service is a classic example. The idea that you could, that everybody could have free health care on the point of delivery was a noble one in 1945, but by the 1970s, it has got completely out of control, and I'm afraid it is in itself, obviously, it's almost an invitation to hypochondria. The knowledge that whatever you say is wrong with you is going to be fixed for free. But also just the sheer weight of public expense in an aging population is today proving to be pretty unsustainable. Labour have got plans to try and deal with it. We'll see whether or not we wind up being what we are slowly becoming at the moment, with some 40% of our revenues being spent on health. We're starting to become a health service with a country attached, rather than the other way around. So that's a severe worry. The Bank of England nationalisation and the mines and all the rest of it also did lead to a drop in productivity, as you'd imagine. Also, politicians took huge advantage of the powers that they had over interest rates and so on. And fortunately, that was actually ended by Gordon Brown when they came to power in 1997, where you have an independent Bank of England, which we all thought was an absolutely wonderful concept until last year, when the 2% of inflation figure that they had as their primary target just went completely haywire, and they, partly through quantitative easing, just sort of went crazy on spending, so and on boosting the economy in the way that they did. So I don't think there was a particular moment, but if there was, it was 1945, and yet it was totally understandable why the British people should have wanted lots of free stuff in 1945, after they had gone through the horrors of the Blitz and the terrible loss of life in the Second World War, and the constant nightly fears. They wanted to have what they called at the time a New Jerusalem to look forward to, in which the Labour Party were offering and the Conservative Party were also offering, but in a much less believable way. And so that explains really much more than anything else, certainly much more than anything to do with Winston Churchill himself, that extraordinary defeat in the 1945 general election, on the day of which, when Clementine Churchill, Mrs. Churchill, said to her husband that it might be a blessing in disguise, Churchill replied, "Well, from where I'm sitting, it looks remarkably well disguised."
I'll hold it, you talk. I'll hold it, you talk. I'll hold it, you talk. What do I need?
This might be a redundant question, but as a physician, I experienced the NHS several years ago when I donated a kidney to a friend of ours in Coventry. I was quite struck by the process. It took 4 years before it was okayed. With all due respect, the dichotomy between private insurance and NHS was stunning.
You certainly don't have to...
What do you think about the future health of the NHS?
Yes,
I know the Liverpool pathway has, I think, been eliminated, hasn't it?
Yes, and there are all sorts of things now that... I mean, Clement Attlee and Aneurin Bevan and the other great Labour leaders who came up with the idea of the NHS, I think would be completely shocked now at the various cosmetic things you're able to get on the NHS. The idea that the taxpayer should pay for people's facelifts and so on, rather than the people themselves, seems extraordinary. There are all sorts of things like that that we are expected to pay for in the NHS, which of course put on enormous costs. Look, a lot of the NHS is cutting edge, is impressive. A lot of the people who work there, including my son actually, at one point recently, are incredibly committed and intelligent, hard-working people who, you know, believe in the dream of the NHS. But even the Labour Party do recognise now, even though of course they make political points about the 7.6 million people on the waiting list, even they do recognise that there's something structural that has to be dealt with. The idea that we have now almost as many administrators for the NHS as we actually have doctors and nurses is insane. Literally insane. It's the largest employer in the world, apart from the Indian railways and the Chinese People's Republican Army. You know, that cannot carry on in a place where taxes are going up and there seem to be no prospect of them coming down. So yes, it's a terrible problem, and one that I would not for a moment be able to answer your question about where it's going to be a generation hence.
With your background as a historian, if you were to read the history of Second World War written by Winston Churchill, would you say that's a very accurate rendering of World War II, or would you say there are some errors or any exaggerations in it?
Well, I have read that book, as you can imagine, cover to cover, and 6 volumes of it. It's a work of literature as much as a work of history. He himself said of it, "I am telling my story." So he wasn't pretending to any degree of complete objectivity. He was not trying to write the ultimate history of the Second World War. He was writing the history of the Second World War from his point of view, which is obviously what makes it a work of literature. And yes, there are people who have written books about the various... he doesn't make factual errors, but he puts a lot of emphasis on some battles, usually the ones where the British are involved, needless to say, and he, I would argue, I have argued, underplays other more important battles that are going on, say, on the Eastern Front. I think it's tremendously important to remember a key statistic of the Second World War is that for every 5 Germans killed in the Second World War, 4 of them died on the Eastern Front. And you certainly wouldn't get that sense if you just read Winston Churchill's history of the Second World War. So what you need to have, I think, is an objective history of the Second World War. For example, the one entitled The Storm of War, which I wrote.
I have a question on a somewhat lighter note, and maybe I'll read it in the book, but to what do you attribute Churchill's longevity, given that he was fond of several martinis in the evening, apparently? I don't know if that's true. He smoked cigars, whatever. He didn't particularly exercise. Is there something unusual in his family background?
No, actually, if anything, his family background actually led to the opposite of longevity. His father died at the age of 45. Several of his uncles and aunts died in their mid-40s as well. He was expecting himself to die in his mid-40s, which was one of the reasons that he had such an extraordinary sort of life force when he was so young. And as you say, he smoked 160,000 cigars in his life. He drank a lot. He was not an alcoholic. Actually, C.P. Scott, the great journalist who knew Churchill well, said that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. So he very much saw alcohol as his servant rather than his master. But he had a rhinocerine capacity for booze, essentially. And so when you ask how come he lived to the age of 90, he was fit and healthy. Up until the age of 50, he used to ride a lot. He played polo. He went shooting and so on. He was an outdoorsman. He was a great sportsman when he was much younger. He was a fencing champion, public school fencing champion, and so on. Of course, he fought in 5 campaigns before the first. Sorry. He was a cavalry officer, exactly, fought in 5 campaigns on 4 continents, you know, before up to 1918. So you have a man who was fit and healthy. But no, I think the thing that kept him alive was this extraordinary life force. You know, he knew exactly, from the age of 16, he was 16 years old, when he told his best friend, Merland Evans, that you and I shall see great upheavals, great struggles in our lives, and I shall save England and save the empire. And he believed that utterly, and then half a century later, he did exactly that. You know, so you have this extraordinary figure, and I think he went on further than that. He didn't just save England and save London. He saved civilization itself.
I have one question for you, which you have a few minutes left, which probably is the subject of another whole lecture. If Churchill were alive today, what would he think about what's going on politically, both in your country and our country?
Churchill was brought up as a leader. He was taught leadership at his school. He was expected as a member of the upper classes to provide leadership. He was taught leadership at Sandhurst as a young officer. He learnt leadership in those 5 campaigns that I mentioned, fought on the 4 continents. He gave tens of thousands of speeches up and down the country and all over the world, but especially up and down the United Kingdom up until he became Prime Minister in May 1940, when he famously said that I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. And the preparation of that life was for leadership. And I do feel that were he to be magically reincarnated and came here now, that he would bewail the paucity of great leadership in the world, or at least in the Western world, in the free world. I think it's something that he would find difficult to understand. You know, there are lots of reasons. I hear reasons endlessly produced about why we can't throw up great leaders. You know, it's the internet, it's the so on Twitter. Winston Churchill would have been brilliant on Twitter. Many of his best lines, of his greatest gags, can be fitted into 280 characters or fewer. It's the job of the leader to fit into the latest technology. It's not the job of the technology to fit into the needs of the leader. So actually, I think you would find that he would bemoan the paucity of great leadership. However, he would have lots of ways, I think, of getting around that and replacing it. One of my senses of Winston Churchill was that he was always interested in the next thing, and so should our leaders be. Thank you very much.
One question, yes or no? Nigel Farage, yes or no?
Yes to coming into the House of Lords. Yes to being a member of Parliament if he could find a constituency. But as far as being Prime Minister concerned, we've got a very good one at the moment. Thank you very much indeed, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen.